I read in Ambrose's book that it was very, very difficult indeed to fly those liberators, and that you were an exceptionally good pilot due to all.
Well, I had
How tough was it?
I had an advantage over some of my colleagues in that I had learned to fly before I signed up with the Air Force. This little college, Dakota Wesleyan, was one of many in the United States that entered into a contract with the government to teach flying. So I learned how to fly a single-engine, simple airplane. I could do it solo. I could do spins and stalls and landings and takeoffs and all those things. So I knew a lot of the rudiments of flying before I joined the Air Force. I signed up in the spring of '42, just 3 or 4 months after Pearl Harbor, but I didn't get called until February of '43 because the Air Force didn't have enough airplanes or instructors or landing fields. After that, things went rather well for me, I think in part because of my previous training. I was also in good shape physically. I wasn't much of an athlete, but I was a track participant. I could run, and I had endurance, and I had no extra weight. So all of those things helped me handle that big Liberator. It was a tough airplane to fly. Through most of the war, it had no hydraulic controls. It was like driving a big truck without any power steering. No power brakes, just the sheer weight of moving it around. And you had to sit there and do that for 9 or 10 hours in formation with your wingtips almost touching the plane next to you. You couldn't fool around in formation flying. And so it was a difficult task. I can see now why the Air Force wanted young pilots, 18, 19, 20, up to 25 years. When you get to be 25, the Air Force considered you an old man.
I want to go to Auschwitz. Actually, Ambrose mentions in his book that one of those missions took you over that place. Can you recall that mission?
I recall, yes, it was one of the longest missions of my career in the Air Force, way up in northeastern Europe. We went to a place called Auschwitz, which is not far from Auschwitz. We probably could have flown directly over Auschwitz, but at that time none of us knew anything about Auschwitz. We didn't know anything about concentration camps or gas ovens or crematoria. That all came to us after the pictures broke when the camps were emancipated near the end of the war. But no flyer that I ever encountered knew anything about Auschwitz or what was going on there until after the war.
You know, when you go into the records, when you read David Wyman's book, so there was a discussion which was merited, I think, whether it was, I mean, decisions could have taken each way, but there was a discussion, and you as pilots or your direct command was totally not part of this discussion.
That is correct. I attended every briefing that the 15th Air Force gave to us. I heard people from the generals on down. I never once heard a mention of the Auschwitz tragedy or of the possibility that American airplanes might interdict what was going on there. It's one of the great tragedies of the war, I think.
McCloy, in a number of his letters to Jewish leaders and to others, says, we've consulted, you know, the people out there in Europe, and Professor Wyman, one of the most honest historians we could find, simply says it was a lie. They did not do it. The decision was made here in Washington.
I think a decision like that would have been made in Washington and no place else. The military, after all, is under civilian direction. We have that principle pretty well established that decisions of that kind that involve humanitarian concerns or personnel concerns or the lives of innocent people, that those decisions would be made in Washington, probably not even at the War Department, but at the White House or the State Department level. It would be based on information from our intelligence agencies. It would be based on reports from our diplomatic corps located in Europe. And then the final decision would probably be made at the White House. But I can assure you that if any discussion like that ever took place in the 15th Air Force, the flyers were totally unaware of it.
I want to ask you now, as a pilot, your view from the cockpit of the Liberator, was it, if you got a mission like this, saying let's bomb the ovens, let's bomb part of them, was it a feasible mission?
You know, those are questions that it's difficult to answer. I would have to say that on the mission I flew either over Auschwitz or near there was a cloudy day where you couldn't have seen the target. We could pick up certain targets by radar. Large oil refineries had a recognizable image where you could identify it. But whether or not you could have bombed the Auschwitz camps, and more specifically the gas chambers and the crematoria, this awful place where I'm told that over 1.5 million innocent Jews were gassed and incinerated. Whether or not we could have hit a target like that from 25,000 feet where we ordinarily flew, I don't know. But we didn't know that about any target. The difference, I suppose, is that in hitting a place like Auschwitz, you don't want to kill the people that are near the target. You don't want to slaughter people who are already fighting to hang on to life, although my guess is that if I were in a camp like that, and I knew that planes were overhead trying to destroy the camp, even though it destroyed me and destroyed my family, I would be cheered in the knowledge that liberation might not be far away. So if it had been up to me, and I say this in the light of hindsight, I'm no great prophet, but in the light of hindsight, I think we should have gone after Auschwitz and taken our chances on killing some of the people there who were innocent, but knocking out those gas chambers and the mass weapons of death. I also think it would have helped if we had bombed the railroad lines leading to Auschwitz. The purpose of those rail lines was to carry human beings to their death. And we might have even been able to use long-range fighter planes to get right down on the tracks and knock them out. And the same with the gas ovens. I will have to tell you that knowing the difficulties of bombing from high altitude on specific targets, that it's at least debatable whether or not we could have crushed those machines at Auschwitz or not. I went on several missions trying to knock out the bridges in the Brenner Pass. We never hit them. It's hard to hit a bridge because from the air it looks like a thread running through those mountain passes. So I think that while it's a possibility, we could have disrupted the slaughter going on there, that I can't tell you that with any certainty.
You see, because the Jews of Hungary, almost 800,000 of them, were transported at the later part of 1944 from Hungary
Yeah.
all the way through to Auschwitz, and there were a number of pleas to the White House, to the Department of War, just bomb those railways. And they even mentioned a certain junction. We have here one of your mission orders where the planes coming back from Auschwitz, the rendezvous point to go back to Italy was above that junction of railroads. This,
We should have hit that junction, and we could have, I think we could have disabled it. We should have hit the rail lines even if we had to go back several times. Now, this is assuming that our top people at the White House and the State Department knew what was going on in Auschwitz. And as you tell me, the Jewish organizations in the United States gave them that information. I've always thought that Franklin Roosevelt was a great man. He's been my political hero. I think that he made two great mistakes in World War II. One was the imprisonment of the Japanese American citizens without any proof of treason on their part. They were, in my opinion, 100% loyal to the United States. Many of them later fought beside the American Army. That was a big and tragic mistake. The other mistake was not to go after Auschwitz, and especially the more practical task of knocking out the rail lines that were taking people to their death in that terrible camp. I think that was a tragic mistake on the part of the president or whoever made that decision at the high levels of our government.
taking you back, to your bases out there in Italy, if a mission like this would have been given, if you would have known what's going on there, can you see people volunteering for a mission like this?
Absolutely. I think there would be whole crews that would volunteer for a mission like that. I have no doubt at all, I don't want to speak boastfully about this, but I have no doubt at all I'd have been one of those who would have volunteered to stop that kind of slaughter if I had known about it at the time. And we could have been briefed on that if that information had gotten to us and our leaders had said, look, this is a humanitarian mission. It's not part of our strategic bombing to paralyze the German war machine. It's a humanitarian mission. How many pilots and crews will volunteer? I think you might be amazed at the sizable number that would have volunteered to do that. And I'd like to think that I would have been among them.
I'm sure you would have been one of the first. I mean, knowing your record in years later on, there's no doubt in my mind that you would have been there.
I volunteered after the war was over to fly bombers loaded with food and clothing and medicine to the countries in Europe that we had been bombing only a short time before. I flew several missions of that kind after I was eligible to go home. That was a humanitarian mission. It was sort of a preview of the Marshall Plan that came later, but certainly anyone who volunteered for a mission like that would volunteer for a life-saving rescue mission at a terrible place like Auschwitz.
I want to ask you now, as a historian and as one of the most knowledgeable students of American politics, we know for sure that the White House, an absolute date is 8th of December 1942, where President Roosevelt speaks to a delegation of Jewish people and he says to them, we know, reports verify exactly what is going on there, and still nothing was done. How do you explain it?
I don't understand it. I can tell you the rationalization for it, and that is that our first job was to knock out Hitler's war machine. I'm sure that a number of people around the president who were saying, if we want to help stop Hitler's slaughter not only the Jewish people, but the terrible slaughter that's going on of Russians and British and later Americans and French. If we want to stop this, we got to concentrate every effort on smashing Hitler's industrial and military structure. And this is the best way we can serve the rescue of the Jews and others who were in Hitler's gun sites, in this case in his gas chamber sites. That was doubtless an erroneous judgment. The overall judgment was right, that Hitler comes first. We've got to knock out this war machine. We even placed that ahead of the defeat of Japan, notwithstanding the fact that Japan was the country that attacked us at Pearl Harbor and brought us in the war. Keep in mind that we made that front wait until we had knocked out Hitler. We made the Russians wait for 3 long years before we invaded from the west on D-Day in 1944. So that view prevailed throughout the government. The Russians were after us for years to open up a second front. They, after all, lost 20 million people killed in that war. Roosevelt held back because of the priority given to knocking out the German war machine. So that's the rationalization for it. I think that there should have been a variation in that rule when it came to possibly saving the lives of millions of Jews who were destroyed at Auschwitz and other concentration camps, Auschwitz being the worst.
We spoke to Elie Wiesel, you know him just?
Yes, he's an old friend of mine.
On Friday, and he sends you his best regards and his love. And he said to us, he started the way you started. I don't know why Roosevelt took this position, but on an historical judgment, says Elie Wiesel, there's no way but concluding that the president was indifferent to what happened to the Jews. And
that's awfully harsh, don't you think? Roosevelt was a humanitarian man. I think his heart beat for people that were in trouble, both in this country and abroad. I think if, in making a decision not to divert from the strategic conclusion that we should concentrate everything on going after the Nazi war machine, I think that was a rationalization that made sense to him at the time and to other strategic planners in the government. But looking back on it, I can only say that God forgive us for what had to be a tragic miscalculation. I think we should have gone after Auschwitz.
You know, we crossed oceans and continents to come over to you, and we again are so thankful for you seeing us, because you are in a unique position. I mean,
Yeah.
There's nobody in the world that can give us a view on this issue like yourself, because you have the view from the cockpit.
Yeah.
I mean, you are a heartbeat from the Oval Office, and you are a renowned historian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, having those 3 hats,
Mm-hmm.
this chapter in American history, how would you define it?
It's a bad chapter in our history. I think probably the decision was made by people who thought they were making a hard-headed judgment that this is the way to win the war and nothing should be allowed to deviate from that course. But certainly with the benefit of hindsight, we have to regret that we did not make the decision to do everything we could to rescue our Jewish brothers and sisters at Auschwitz. Now, I have to add to that, I'm not sure what would have happened if such a raid had been ordered and we were off a little bit with our aiming devices and killed large numbers of Jewish people who were there as prisoners and missed the gas chambers
I want to tell you what Elie Wiesel said to it. He said, I was ready to die. I was just waiting for an effort of the world to show that I'm worth something, that I'm not, that I'm a human being, not just an it. That was Elie Wiesel reply to your thought.
Well, there's an eyewitness account that I trust. Elie Wiesel is a man of enormous learning and knowledge and experience. And if that is his view of it, that's a healthy-minded, wholesome view from a man who's very pro-American in his instincts. He's pro-Israel, he's pro-American. He's certainly anti-Hitler. And if that's his view, it carries a lot of weight with me. I'm just trying to paint the worst possible picture that could happen, and that is a clean mess of the target and killing people in their cells, in their barracks that are innocent. That could happen. I've been on missions where we missed the target and hit civilian populations. It gives you a sickening feeling when you see the photographic evidence of that. So
those people were doomed anyhow.
Yes, I think they were doomed, and they were doomed to deaths that were probably worse than being extinguished by heavy bombardment. But I'm just giving you the negative side of what might have happened. The positive side, and something that we had a pretty good chance of carrying out, is that we could have interdicted those rail lines going into Auschwitz, blasted them off the earth, which would have interrupted the flow of people to these death chambers. And secondly, we had probably a pretty good chance of knocking out those gas ovens. Now, that doesn't mean that the Nazis would have not moved in with machine guns and just knocked everybody to their deaths anyway. So there's all kinds of ifs here.
But not with the efficiency.
No, not with
operating 4 gas chambers at the rate of burning 12,000 Jews every day.
Yeah.
Every day. I mean, that they couldn't have done with machine guns. And you know, Senator, 437,000 Jews, Hungarian Jews that were transported, were killed in Auschwitz.
Yeah.
The sheer number of it, you know, it could have been stopped. At least it was worth an effort.
It was worth an effort. Despite all the risks, it was certainly worth the effort to do that. The only reason I cite these negative possibilities is that I don't want to leave the impression that the U.S. Air Force was perfect in its aiming and in its bombing missions. But there's no question that we should have attempted it. And if you'd have taken a vote among the rank and file flyers, the pilots, the bombardiers, the navigators, the gunners, I think there'd have been an overwhelming vote in favor of such a mission, or 2 or 3 or 4 missions if necessary to achieve our purposes.
We are doing this show, we are raising this issue on the eve, as I told you, of the leaders of the free world gathering in Auschwitz, you know, commemorating 60 years to the liberation of the camp. Do you think we have good reason for doing it, for bringing it up, this question?
Oh, absolutely, because what we want to derive from the experience of Auschwitz and the slaughter of the Jewish people is a determination never again will we have the capacity to do something about that and not exercise the full capacity of our strength and our judgment in that direction. We should have gone all out during the Second World War. We can never again permit that kind of genocide to take place as long as we have breath and life and are able to do something about it. And it's perfectly logical there should be an observation of the anniversary of the liberation of the people from this tragic and horrible place. I spent a full day going through Auschwitz with several of my staff when I served as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I'll never forget that as long as I live. I walked through that chamber all those terrible places with tears literally streaming down my cheeks, thinking of what happened there in a civilized country. After all, Germany gave us Bach, and Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart, Goethe, Schweitzer, Luther, Thomas Mann, all these great figures, and yet Hitler intellectually and morally debauched an entire civilized nation and turned them to this murderous, genocidal attack that should never again be permitted.